Thank you for your attendance this morning and for staying to hear the obscure presenter at the end of the panel. I must begin by acknowledging what a great privilege it is for me to speak at the same conference and on the same morning with scholars whose work has done so much to assist me in my research on the late Roman Danubian Balkan provinces, which I will just for convenience sake call Illyricum in this paper. We shall hope and maybe even pray that I rise to the occasion, or at least endeavor to keep everyone awake. There's a legitimate question. What is there left to say after four such wonderful papers? I'll see if I can do something a bit different, although you probably have seen most of this evidence before. As has become common practice in our 3 days together at this conference, I wanted to begin by revising my paper's topic just a bit. It's my contention that scholars have tended to see Jerome the Illyrian, or as Professor Moreau put it, Illyricianus, at the two ends of his life, defined on the one hand as the search for his birthplace, which we undertook yesterday, and on the other hand, his anxiety about the insecurity of the region in the mounting series of catastrophes that began at Adrianople, as Professor Patronage just told us. So, can we distinguish the influence of Jerome's Illyrian childhood and of his years in Aquileia when he was in his 20s in his writings apart from those two places, which I think have been well described and well analyzed already in this panel? So, to put it another way, and again, part of the project to try and keep people awake, can we actually talk about Jerome wearing a kind of Ammonian toga? And here I decided to represent that with the famous 2nd century statue. At any point in his later life, does he appear this way, or is his background ultimately not recoverable? Again, apart from these two places, at the beginning of his life and at the end. So, let's try to handle some initial objections to this. I think it's always good to anticipate problems. I think everyone has probably read already or seen in the slides how much scorn Jerome can heap upon his native place. But I just want to review that just a bit. Jerome does not have this wonderful, say, Jupiter or God's eye view of Illyricum. He has, in his letters, a less sanguine view. This postcard, which I love very much, I saw it in Professor Balanch's book. The only thing that's interesting about this postcard is if you imagine the elderly Jerome thinking back to Stridon or just to Illyricum generally, I think if you had a little thought bubble over his head, his thoughts might not be so positive. He's staring off into space. We may hope that he is fondly thinking of his hometown, but perhaps not. These quotations you've already seen. I give them to you in English, thankfully, because Professor Moreau has already given them to you in Latin. This idea, perhaps in letter 6, is perhaps rhetorical. The idea that he's forgotten his homeland may merely be an argument in the context of the letter in saying that he's been so overcome by the desert that he no longer remembers where he's really from. It would be even more intriguing if he said he did this in Rome, but we don't have letters from that period. Letter 7 is a little bit more interesting for me. I cut this quotation off earlier than my colleague did, largely because when he talks about his native place here, he not only makes the comments about Lucinus, but he immediately goes to this joke from Cicero. And I think he makes this joke even to rub in the point even more, that he is not from this place, because the implication is, to understand this joke, I think you have to kind of know the reference, you have to know who this Crassus is, you have to appreciate that this is the kind of thing that Roman Republicans thought was funny. I would be curious if someone thinks this is a more common joke. If it's a peasant joke, then I'm wrong. But I think because he goes so quickly to talking about Lucilius, this is one more way that he reinforces that people in Stridon or in Illyricum, they wouldn't get the joke. I mean, he connects with his audience and he says, oh, well, this is the kind of thing that I can say about them, but that they themselves would never say. They lack they lack the ability to appreciate it here. And finally, of course, the ultimate sort of put down of his patria is the letter 64, which again you've already seen, when he directs his brother Hieronymus to go and sell his inheritance, to sort of firmly break, at least, and it's hard to quantify. I know that we've asked people exactly how much inheritance he has, but to sort of clearly demarcate himself from, this lingering possession that he had in the region. I won't say he disinherits himself, because the money, of course, has to go to fund his new patria in Bethlehem. But it seems to me to be symbolically important that he wants to disentangle himself from where he came from financially as well as culturally. So, there's someone in this room right now who's thinking, maybe Craig shouldn't keep going, right? Jerome doesn't really want to tell us about Illyricum. It's kind of obvious. He despises it, again, perhaps rhetorically, and he reinvents himself over and over in his writings in a way that breaks him free from the pull of his native place. We can do marvelous prosopography. He can't get away from the people that Professor Moreau told us about, that they're still part of his life. But as far as defining himself as an Illyrian, it's more problematic. And if I already tell you that I'm not going to talk about his birthplace, and I'm not going to talk about the Goths, then I put myself in what might be a very tough spot. But, and this is significant, Jerome lived through some very critical history in his homeland. And here, I'm not talking about the barbarians. I'm talking about the domestic issues or the internal factors that several of my archaeological colleagues have brought up already. This is the history that Professor Bartosz told us about yesterday when we were looking out at the Julian Alps. And it's my contention that these events, in particular the civil struggle, the civil wars of the mid to maybe third quarter of the 4th century, helped define one part of Jerome's sense of what life in Illyricum is like. Now, this map is very problematic, and if you're having difficulty staying awake, go ahead and criticize this map. It's older than some of us in the room. But the map is interesting for this reason, just to begin, because it's a very military map, and Jerome is a very civilian man, right? Jerome, when he talks about trying to orient himself in the Roman world, he makes a very sort of characteristic comment in his commentary on Micah, on the prophet Micah. He says that the Roman world is made peaceful by a ring of a very small number of soldiers all around the periphery. And this, again, is a kind of rhetoric, but what's interesting about this is he doesn't seem to want to talk about soldiers. He wants to talk about the peaceful life predicted by Isaiah and by Micah, which is made possible by this armed fringe, if you like. This necessary thing that, like many Roman civilians, he seems to have relatively little contact with. The security of Dalmatia and Pannonia was founded upon a guarded Danubian frontier, with which Jerome is apparently not directly, doesn't really want to talk about. So, within that framework of what's supposed to be a civilian world, let's talk about Heliodorus, or the letter to Heliodorus, again, which you have seen before in Latin, I think, although perhaps not this portion, right? We saw, Professor Bartosz told us, the part of it that describes in detail the barbarian invasions, as I'll just call them in quotes, the barbarian invasions. This is an earlier part, and traditionally this part of this letter has been held up as a trope. And we can go into exactly what Tocos is, but this is the consolation letter to Heliodorus for the death of his son, and these are the kinds of catastrophes that Jerome adduces to show that death is a kind of a commonplace. And most commentators that I've read have suggested that this is very perfunctory. This is a list of just well-known disasters. For an American audience, you could, I guess, start with the Hindenburg and end with 9/11 or something. I mean, it's just things that would show up on YouTube almost. But I will try to read this closely and suggest that some of these things are actually more interesting than they first appear. So the first one is the way that he describes the death of Valentinian I. And if I had all day, I could talk about Valentinian and Petronius Probus, and the fact that Jerome is one of our sources for some interesting details about the Emperor Valentinian, the Pannonian Emperor. But instead what I want to say here is the idea that he left his country unavenged, bearing in mind that Valentinian did not die after Adrianople. Right? Very significantly, Valentinian dies before them. So Jerome is referring to, I think, a crisis before the crisis. And that actually is a certain level of sophistication. Either his chronology is corrupt and he's just, again, heaping disaster upon disaster, or, and in particular because he wants to talk about his patria, right, the shame that comes over Valentinian here after, in his death. I think Jerome knows something. I think he understands from more of an insider's perspective, because this is right around the time that he was departing Aquileia to go east, that he already understands that there is a Pannonian crisis before the much greater Illyrian crisis. If anyone wants me to talk more about that, I can. The Valentinian second passage here is somewhat pathetic. If I gave you the full passage, it's of course the young man who's taken captive by two different generals and ultimately sort of murdered and then hanged, gibbeted in some English translations. The passage that I like here, though, and I should have bolded this, he went into exile and he recovered his power by bloodshed. Right? This is Jerome casting some shade, in the English expression, upon the civil war fought by Theodosius that restored Valentinian II. Why would he have maybe a negative appraisal of this civil war? Again, one theory is because, as my archaeological colleagues have already said, because that civil war came here. Because Theodosius' invasion, moved through this very region. It's quite likely that some of Jerome's friends and perhaps Jerome's correspondence that we saw earlier might have been affected by this. But I think he, other people, Ambrose, for example, would say very positive things about the Civil War. The fact that Valentinian II is in some ways castigated for having to endure this or having to regain power through this, I think is surprising. Now, this is the catalog part, right? Procopius, Maximus, that's Magnus Maximus, and Eugenius, right? These are just usurpers, failed would-be emperors of the 4th century. Why should you care? Okay, I have some time left. And I won't talk about the Horace quote, which is interesting in its own right. I should just say what groups them together for Jerome is that they actually faced defeat and were forced to accept captivity as part of their fall from power. So, there's Valentinian I, Valentinian II. I can give you a pathetic coin of Valentinian II. Procopius I can actually dispense with relatively quickly. Procopius for Illyricum is a failed emperor because he fails to take Illyricum. The comes, not really the prefect, was supposed to hand over the passes in Thrace to him and allow him to march on Sirmium and all these places. It doesn't happen. His usurpation fails for many reasons, but one of the major reasons is that he's unable to take the Western Empire, and then faces Valens and is defeated in relatively short order. But Magnus Maximus now, this is more interesting, because Magnus Maximus actually is taken in captivity by Theodosius in Aquileia, right? So this is a place, Jerome wasn't there, but the interesting thing for me is that this civil war comes about as close to Jerome and his friends as any, right? Aquileia is besieged, right? Magnus Maximus is handed over, right, to Theodosius and directly faces this kind of captivity. Now, you could say Jerome merely read about this somewhere. It's a good story. It shows, again, the vanity of kings or the fleeting power of powerful people. On the other hand, you can say this is a very pointed example because of where this happened and how abject the surrender is, right? This is a man who's literally caught inside this city that Jerome knows very well, and surrenders to Theodosius' mercy, and is, according to some accounts, murdered in front of him. Similarly, Eugenius, right? Of course, the failed would-be emperor at the Battle of Frigidus, to whom I'm indebted to Professor Bashbush for explaining this. I think what's interesting about Eugenius is, of course, that his soldiers then fled to Aquileia and had to negotiate, Chromatius negotiates their surrender. and actually negotiates for their lives. So in this case, actually isn't Eugenius who is the captive, it's actually his soldiers. And Jerome doesn't say this. So you can legitimately say, well, does Jerome really even know the details of the usurpation? Does he really care? You know, this is one of these questions of how much can you interrogate Jerome? And if I had an infinite amount of time to show you images, I'll show you a Roman bridge and sort of talk about how much weight can you put on a passage. On the other hand, Jerome could have gone back further. He could have talked about Licinius, for example. He could have gone much deeper into Roman history. He gives you examples of failed emperors all from his own lifetime. Right? No Constantinian examples, nothing earlier than that. And he does seem to believe that Heliodorus, who was a former military man, is going to grasp all of these details. I think we can make some assumptions based on his addressee. So I don't think these are merely name-dropping catastrophes. In the end, I think there's some significance, some Illyrian significance, to the fact that he uses these men. So I have just a few minutes, not long, but I have theologians present, I have experts in religious history, and I want to suggest why Jerome is so frustrating on political and military issues by referring to the chapter by Philip Rousseau in the Cardiff volume edited by Professors Kane and Russell. One of the things that Philip Rousseau says in his chapter that I think is very interesting is he says, the reason that Jerome, and I'm simplifying, never wrote Augustine's City of God is in part because his conception of Christian history leaves him between the coming of the apostles and the second coming of Jesus, with no real need for a Christian empire to be victorious or profitable or productive. In some ways, he lives in a space where civil wars haven't changed, and I would like to interrogate Jerome further on this if I could, but the question is, if emperors have always been trying to kill each other, right? Christianity seems to have made no difference. So why then spend too much time dealing with Constantine or his sons or any of these other people? Because this is, in a way, kind of background noise for a Christian. The world has not changed and will not change fundamentally in a political sense until the second coming. And I think Rousseau is, at least to me, very convincing on that point. So I will conclude. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank all of my colleagues for observing the time and allowing me any time to speak. I have one outlandish comparison to make, and I'll spend 30 seconds. If you don't think that there's any other Illyrian who famously rejects his patrimony, I leave you Julian, who also very famously rejects his Thracian identity and picks up his Hellenic identity. Again, something else we could talk about at greater length, but I think Jerome would hate to be lumped in with Julian in any context. But it's curious to me that both men make that same rhetorical play. Anyway, I've come to the end of my talk. As my sharp-eyed colleagues have seen, I've replaced the image of Slovenia with an image of my home institution, my university in North Carolina. And I want to depart you now with profound gratitude to the Slovenian Academy, and to the Franciscan friars, and to this beautiful country for making me feel at home. And with the reminder that the character of Jerome's patria not only speaks to Slovenians, but to people from very faraway places, including people as far away as the United States in the mountains. Thank you very much.